General MacArthur, often called the American shogun, observed this change with both pride and caution. The Japanese people, he wrote, possessed a spirit that could either build the world or burn it. Under Allied guidance, that spirit turned toward creation. The Ministry of Education launched reforms that emphasized science, civic responsibility, and global awareness. Women gained the right to vote, and newspapers flourished with open criticism, something unimaginable only years before. The Allied occupation, which might have bred resentment, instead became a strange partnership. American soldiers and Japanese civilians coexisted with unexpected harmony. The occupying forces shared food, medicine, even baseball. Children would gather around GIs offering chocolate bars or chewing gum, small gestures that left lasting memories. For a generation raised on propaganda that depicted Americans as monsters, these acts of kindness were transformative. The same American soldiers who once dropped bombs on Japan were now teaching English, building schools, and showing films, this time of peace, not war. Documentaries about democracy and civic participation were screened across the country. These weren't propaganda pieces, but lessons in rebuilding trust. Trust between government and people, between Japan and the world. By 1950, the physical scars of war were still visible, but the emotional tone of the nation had shifted. Streets bustled with merchants, students filled universities, and factories buzzed with the energy of recovery. The introduction of new technologies, radio, photography, and later television, gave Japan a modern voice. Through them, the nation began to redefine itself. The emperor, though stripped of divine status, remained a quiet anchor of stability. His post-war visits to Hiroshima, to rural villages, to industrial towns, were not grand gestures of power, but symbols of humility. Each handshake, each bow, reinforced the idea that leadership could coexist with humanity. Yet beneath this new confidence, Japan continued to wrestle with memory. The Allied imposed censorship that restricted discussion of the atomic bombings complicated the nation's moral awakening. Many citizens struggled with dual grief, for the victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and for those their country had victimized abroad. It was a balance few nations had ever faced, to mourn one's own suffering while acknowledging one's guilt. This duality became the foundation of modern Japanese identity. Schoolchildren learned of the war not as a story of heroes and enemies, but as a tragedy born of pride and deception. Museums opened dedicated to both peace and remembrance. The Peace Memorial Museum in Hiroshima, the Chidorigafuchi National Cemetery in Tokyo. Each monument carried the same unspoken message: never again. Economically, Japan's transformation was nothing short of miraculous. With American assistance through the Dodge Plan and later the Korean War boom, industries revived. In less than 2 decades, the nation that had once been reduced to ashes became one of the world's leading economies. By the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, Japan had fully reintroduced itself to the world, not as a conqueror, but as a symbol of resilience and rebirth. But perhaps the most profound change could not be measured in statistics. It was visible in the quiet dignity of the post-war generation. Men and women who had seen the face of war and vowed to never repeat it. When they rebuilt their homes, they planted gardens beside them. When they reopened schools, they filled them with lessons on tolerance. The tears that had fallen in 1945, tears of defeat, disbelief, and awakening, had watered the soil of a new Japan. A Japan that would lead the world not through empire, but through example. From the ashes of blind devotion rose a democracy grounded in reflection. From the silence of surrender came the voice of peace. And, from the shattered image of a god-emperor, emerged a nation that learned, at last, the strength of humanity itself. The story of Japan's surrender is often told as the end of war, but in truth, it was the beginning of understanding, a reckoning deeper than defeat. and more enduring than victory. In August 1945, the Japanese people had looked to the heavens for divine purpose and found only silence. Yet in that silence, something remarkable happened. They began to listen to one another. They began to see, with unclouded eyes, the cost of their faith in myth. What followed was not the erasure of Japan's soul, but its purification. The same culture that once glorified obedience and sacrifice now found beauty and humility, craftsmanship and peace. Where once there were parades of conquest, there were now processions of remembrance. Where once the nation bowed to a throne, it now bowed to truth. The Americans came as occupiers, but left as architects of an extraordinary rebirth. Their greatest victory was not military, it was moral. They showed a defeated people that repentance was not weakness, that democracy was not chaos, and that the truest power of a nation lies not in its armies, but in its conscience. For the Japanese civilians who wept when they saw the truth about their emperor, those tears were not the end of faith. They were its rebirth. They no longer worshipped a god in human form. They began to believe in humanity itself. And in the decades that followed, Japan proved that peace could be stronger than war. The empire that once brought the world to its knees would rise again, not with fire or steel, but with art, innovation, and grace. History remembers the day Japan surrendered as one of loss. But in the quiet that followed, it became something far greater. The moment a nation learned that even in the ruins of belief, there can still be light, if one dares to face the truth. General MacArthur's administration encouraged this process carefully, aware that too much humiliation could breed rebellion. Show them enough, one officer noted, to awaken conscience, not to destroy it. The occupation authorities called it reorientation, but for the people inside those darkened theaters, it felt more like confession. Outside the screening halls, newspapers began printing testimonies from returning soldiers. Men who had fought in China or Burma spoke of things they had seen and done. Villages burned, prisoners executed, civilians used as labor. Their stories contradicted years of propaganda that had glorified sacrifice and duty. For the first time, truth was being told not through imperial decree, but through human voice. Among the most powerful revelations were photographs of Japanese POWs returning home. Many were skeletal, broken men who spoke of the war's futility. Their presence shattered another illusion, that death for the emperor was noble and survival was shameful. Now, survival itself was an act of courage. In rural towns, local priests and teachers began organizing small memorial services, not only for Japanese soldiers who had died, but for foreign victims as well. Such gestures were quiet, often private, but they signaled a profound moral shift. The old ideology of divine right and racial superiority had collapsed. In its place grew something fragile but real: empathy. The Allies also showed the Japanese civilians films of their own cities, destroyed by American firebombing: Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and finally Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The images of burned children and flattened neighborhoods were unbearable, but they created a strange duality in the national consciousness. The Japanese saw themselves as both perpetrators and victims, a nation punished and awakened at once. When news of the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal reached the public, emotions were mixed. Some felt betrayed by the generals and ministers who had led them into destruction. Others clung to the belief that the emperor had been misled. But when testimonies of atrocities were read aloud in court, the systematic killings in Nanking, the experiments of Unit 731, the executions of prisoners, the evidence left little room for denial. Radio broadcasts of the trials echoed across Japan. Words like crimes against humanity entered the language for the first time. The nation that had once worshipped power now listened to its leaders being judged by the world. In one of the final broadcasts of 1946, A woman's voice on the radio read aloud a message from a Hiroshima survivor. "We believed the emperor was a god. Now we see he is a man. And because he is a man, perhaps he too can feel our sorrow." It was a simple sentence, but it captured the transformation of a nation. The myth had ended, but in its place came something more enduring: the capacity for reflection. By the time Emperor Hirohito visited Hiroshima in person, the screenings, the trials, and the ruins had already done their work. Japan's collective illusion had shattered, and from its fragments, a new identity was forming, one not built on conquest, but on remorse and reconstruction. The tears of those who watched the films were not only of grief, they were of awakening, the painful beginning of truth. And from that truth, the rebuilding of Japan would truly begin. When the final echoes of surrender faded, Japan stood in ruins, not only in its cities, but in its soul. The emperor's word had ended a war, but it had also stripped away the foundation of belief that had sustained his nation for generations. In the space left behind, the Americans began a task unlike any in history: rebuilding a former enemy, not through punishment, but through transformation. General Douglas MacArthur, now Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, ruled from the Daiichi Building, his office window facing the Imperial Palace itself. Each morning he would look out across the moat, aware that behind those stone walls lived the man once considered divine. Their first meeting on September 27, 1945, was an encounter between myth and modernity. The famous photograph taken that day captured it perfectly. MacArthur, tall and casual in an open-collar shirt, stood beside the emperor, who was stiff, formal, and visibly uneasy. The contrast spoke louder than any speech. The god now stood beside a man, and both were human. Behind the scenes, the American occupation set out to reshape Japan from the ground up. Demilitarization was only the beginning. Entire institutions of thought, the education system, the press, even religious organizations, were dismantled and rebuilt to encourage democracy and individual rights. Censorship was lifted. New textbooks told a story not of divine conquest, but of human cost. The emperor himself became the central figure in this transformation. Under MacArthur's guidance, Hirohito renounced his divinity in a national radio broadcast on New Year's Day, 1946. His words were measured, but their impact was seismic. The ties between us and our people have always stood upon mutual trust and affection. They do not depend upon the false conception that the emperor is divine. It was the death of a millennium-old belief. Many Japanese cried as they listened, not in anger, but in release. For the first time, they were allowed to see their ruler not as an unreachable god, but as a man who shared their suffering. Across Japan, the work of rebuilding took on an almost spiritual quality. Women swept rubble from the streets. Children carried bricks to repair schools. Farmers returned to their burned fields, planting the first crops of peace. Food shortages persisted, disease spread, but a quiet determination replaced despair. The Americans distributed leaflets encouraging civic participation and freedom of thought. In classrooms, teachers led open discussions, something that had been unthinkable under imperial rule. Radio stations began airing Western music, films, and debates. The black markets that had thrived during the war slowly gave way to organized trade. But beneath this surface recovery lay a deeper transformation, moral and psychological. The films, trials, and testimonies that had shaken Japan in 1946 continued to ripple through its consciousness. For many, shame turned into resolve. Artists, writers, and journalists began to explore the meaning of guilt, memory, and responsibility. Novels like Black Rain and films like The Burmese Harp would later capture that silent reckoning. Stories of soldiers and civilians coming to terms with the lies they had believed. The arts became Japan's second tribunal, a mirror held up to the nation's conscience. MacArthur's reforms culminated in the drafting of a new constitution, signed in 1947. It enshrined democracy, human rights, and, most dramatically, Article 9, in which Japan forever renounced war as a means of settling international disputes. The empire that had once prided itself on its warrior spirit now outlawed the sword. This transformation astonished the world. The Allies had expected resistance, perhaps even revolt. Instead, the Japanese people accepted the reforms with humility, not from fear, but from fatigue and moral awakening. The old ideology had collapsed under the weight of truth, and from its ashes rose a new ideal: peace. Yet the process was not without conflict. Some nationalists whispered that Japan had been humiliated beyond repair. Others, especially the youth, embraced change with fervor. The streets of Tokyo became a paradox. American jeeps rolling past shrines where incense still burned for the war dead. But through it all, one symbol remained constant: the emperor, now walking among his people. Hirohito began traveling across the country, visiting towns shattered by bombings, bowing to widows, listening to farmers. Photographs of him standing in muddy fields, speaking to children, became iconic. The god had become a man, and in doing so, he helped his people become human again. The rebuilding of Japan was not simply economic. It was moral. It was the long, painful reconciliation of faith and truth, pride and guilt. And through that struggle, a new Japan was born, one whose strength would no longer be measured in conquest, but in conscience. By the late 1940s, Japan had begun to rise again, not through armies or flags, but through ideas. The same discipline that once fueled imperial expansion was now redirected into rebuilding, education, and innovation. Factories that had once produced weapons were repurposed for civilian use. Steel for tanks became steel for bridges. The spirit of perseverance, long central to Japanese culture, was reborn in a new form: peaceful productivity. The moral angle of this transformation was complex. Some Japanese intellectuals welcomed the occupation reforms, calling them a liberation from the chains of militarism. Others viewed them as a humiliation, a forced confession at the hands of victors. Yet even among the bitter, few could deny the new reality. The Emperor's Humanity Declaration in January 1946 confirmed what the films and broadcasts had already implied. Japan's gods were men, and its leaders fallible. That announcement rippled through the nation's soul. In shrines and temples, priests paused their prayers to reconsider the nature of divinity. Was the emperor still the intermediary between heaven and earth? Or was he simply another man burdened by sorrow? In homes, families debated whether to continue traditional rituals. Some clung to the old faith. Others quietly turned away, unable to reconcile it with what they now knew. Through these cultural shifts, the psychological foundation of Japan changed more rapidly than anyone expected. Within a single year, the country that had once exalted obedience above all began to rediscover individuality. Art, literature, and philosophy flourished again, free from the constraints of wartime censorship. Writers such as Osamu Dazai and Yasunari Kawabata explored guilt, beauty, and human fragility in a ruined landscape. Their stories reflected the same emotional journey the nation was undergoing, from blind faith to painful self-awareness. In this way, the films and reforms of the occupation were not merely acts of political control. They were acts of moral reconstruction. The Allied soldiers who came with food and projectors did more than feed bodies. They fed understanding. For the first time in centuries, Japan was being asked to see itself as others had seen it. And as the truth spread, the people began to ask the question that would define their post-war identity. If the emperor was human, then what could Japan become without him as its god? The answer would come in the form of one man, the emperor himself, stepping out from behind the veil of divinity to face his people. Not as a ruler, but as a man among ruins. The winter air in Tokyo was crisp and thin when Emperor Hirohito stepped from his car and faced his people. Unguarded, unarmored, and, for the first time in history, mortal. It was early 1946, and the capital still looked like a city of ghosts. Half-burned houses stood beside empty lots where entire neighborhoods had vanished in firestorms. Snow gathered quietly over blackened timbers, softening the ruins that once echoed with the machinery of empire. The emperor's motorcade moved slowly through the broken streets. Children watched from behind their mothers' kimonos, whispering his name in disbelief. To see him in person was, for many, like watching a god descend to earth. But this god was smaller than legend, and he bowed. It began as a quiet visit to inspect the damage and offer encouragement. Yet word of his journey spread rapidly. Crowds gathered at every stop, kneeling or bowing low, unsure whether to weep or rejoice. Hirohito's expression was calm, almost expressionless, but those who saw him up close spoke of his eyes. Tired, haunted, filled with something that looked like apology. The photographs from those visits became some of the most haunting images of post-war Japan. In one, Hirohito stands amid the rubble of Tokyo, a slight figure in a plain overcoat, surrounded by smiling children and soldiers of the occupation. Behind him, the ruins stretch endlessly into the distance, the visual end of an age. The emperor's presence in these devastated places had a profound effect on the people. He no longer appeared as a celestial being shielded by sacred walls. He was a man walking among the broken, stepping carefully over the same ashes that covered everyone else's lives. His once imperial words, formal, distant, abstract, were replaced by simple phrases: gratitude, perseverance, renewal. "We must rebuild," he said, with sincerity and with peace. For a nation raised to believe that the emperor's footsteps could never touch common ground, this was a transformation beyond comprehension. People who had prayed to his portrait now saw him shake the hands of orphans, bow to laborers, and smile at farmers offering him rice. The divine distance had vanished. In its place stood a quiet, trembling humanity. General MacArthur understood the magnitude of this transformation. He had chosen not to remove Hirohito, believing that the emperor's survival would stabilize the country. "Destroy him," MacArthur said privately, "and you destroy Japan itself." The gamble worked. By allowing Hirohito to live as a symbol of continuity, the Allies gave the Japanese people something to hold on to as they faced a world stripped of myth. Yet, the very sight of their emperor walking freely beside American generals created an emotional rift. For some, it was liberation, proof that the old chains had been broken. For others, it was unbearable humiliation. Conservative voices within Japan whispered that the emperor had been reduced to a puppet, a figurehead under the watchful eyes of foreign powers. But most ordinary citizens saw something deeper. A man who shared their shame and suffering, who had chosen to remain visible when disappearance might have been easier. The Ningen Sengen, his humanity declaration issued that January, had already stripped him of divine status. But the declaration's true power came not from words, but from sight. Seeing him in the streets, thin and human, erased centuries of reverence in a single instant. In those months, newspapers published photographs of Hirohito in factories, hospitals, and schools. Each image carried quiet symbolism: the emperor standing beside a wounded veteran, his hand resting lightly on the man's shoulder; the emperor smiling faintly at a classroom of children who bowed not in worship, but in curiosity. These moments, small and almost tender, reshaped the nation's image of itself. When the emperor visited Hiroshima in December 1947, the transformation reached its emotional peak. Survivors lined the streets, many too frail to stand. They had once believed that his divine spirit protected them. Now they saw him walking through the ruins that disproved that faith. Witnesses recalled that some survivors bowed deeply, while others simply turned away, unable to reconcile love and loss in the same moment. One woman reportedly said, "We believed he could not die, but here he is, alive, like us. That is harder to bear." The emperor said little during that visit. He laid a wreath of flowers, bowed deeply, and moved on. No speech could contain what the moment meant, not only for Hiroshima, but for all of Japan. This was the turning point, the death of divinity, the birth of humanity. Hirohito's quiet humility became both the symbol of defeat and the foundation for rebirth. He no longer ruled by command, but by example. By showing that even the highest among them could bow, apologize, and begin again. And yet, beyond the emperor's calm public image, another confrontation awaited the Japanese people, a confrontation with the full truth of their war, captured by the very cameras their leaders had once forbidden. The lights dimmed in a Tokyo hall that once echoed with patriotic speeches and marching songs. Rows of Japanese civilians, teachers, clerks, students, widows, sat in silence, facing a white screen. The year was 1946, and for the first time, the Japanese people were about to see what the rest of the world had already witnessed. The film projector flickered to life. A whirring sound filled the room, followed by images that seemed impossible. Burned villages, mass graves, emaciated prisoners of war stumbling behind barbed wire. The footage had been captured by Allied troops across Asia, from Nanking to the Philippines to Singapore, documenting the empire's brutal trail of conquest. There were no narrations, no propaganda slogans, no patriotic music. Only grainy, black-and-white silence punctuated by the sound of the reels. Some people in the hall gasped. Others turned their faces away. A few whispered prayers. For many, this was the first time they had seen Japan's war not as glorious expansion, but as devastation inflicted on others. Allied authorities had organized these screenings deliberately, not for vengeance, but for revelation. The goal was to dismantle the myth of purity that wartime propaganda had built. The Japanese press, tightly controlled during the war, had never shown the suffering of foreign civilians or prisoners. The Imperial Army's atrocities were whispered rumors, dismissed as enemy lies. Now, the evidence played before their eyes. One sequence showed Allied soldiers entering a prison camp in the Philippines. Emaciated men, Americans, Australians, Filipinos, stared back at the camera with hollow eyes. The film cut to piles of bodies outside Nanking's walls, and then to women and children lying in the mud. The audience froze. The air felt heavy, like the silence after a prayer unanswered. When the lights came back on, no one spoke. The audience remained seated, motionless. Some men bowed their heads so deeply that their foreheads touched the floor. A few women sobbed quietly into their sleeves. The realization spread through the room like a slow wave. The empire that had promised to protect Asia had instead destroyed it. In other halls across Japan, similar screenings took place. These films became an unspoken form of collective reckoning. The civilians wept not only for the victims on the screen, but for the truth of what had been done in their name. Teachers who had once lectured about the emperor's divine mission now struggled to explain to their students how such horrors could have occurred under his banner. Yet within that collapse lay the seed of rebirth. Japan, humbled and stripped of illusion, would soon begin to rebuild, guided not by myth, but by truth, discipline, and the strange compassion of former enemies. And within this fragile transition, countless ordinary lives, soldiers, mothers, and children, would experience the most human of emotions: shame, grief, gratitude, and the quiet hope that history's weight could somehow be lifted. In the weeks after Japan's surrender, the country seemed to breathe for the first time in years. But every breath came with disbelief. The empire that had demanded blind devotion was gone. replaced overnight by strange men in foreign uniforms who smiled, handed out candy, and spoke of peace. For ordinary civilians, the psychological dissonance was overwhelming. They had been raised to see Americans as beasts who would desecrate shrines, enslave women, and burn every inch of their sacred land. Instead, they watched as American soldiers repaired bridges, cleared rubble, and shared food with hungry families. The occupiers did not act like conquerors. They acted like rescuers. And that simple reversal shook the nation's spirit more deeply than defeat itself. In Tokyo, a U.S. Army medical team opened one of the first relief stations near Ueno Park. A woman named Sachiko, widowed by the bombings, recalled seeing an American sergeant bandage a Japanese child's wounded leg. "He did not speak our language," she said years later, "but he bowed when he finished." That gesture, so small yet unthinkable before the war, spread through word of mouth like a revelation. The enemy bows too. For many Japanese, the shock was not only moral but existential. Their emperor, the Son of Heaven, had told them to fight to the death for him. They had obeyed, believing that surrender would dishonor generations of ancestors. Yet here stood the enemy, treating them with decency that their own leaders had denied. That realization tore at the very roots of loyalty and faith. The human angle of this occupation was defined by quiet contradictions. Children who once sang patriotic songs now played baseball with American soldiers. Former Imperial soldiers, ashamed and disoriented, worked under Allied engineers rebuilding bridges they had sworn to destroy. In schoolyards and ruins, two worlds met. One stripped of pride, the other uncertain of how mercy should feel. The Japanese press, heavily censored during the war, now operated under Allied supervision. Newspapers published photographs of MacArthur standing beside Emperor Hirohito, the tall, confident American towering over the frail figure in a mourning coat. The image shocked Japan. For the first time, the emperor looked small, human, even fragile. Many who saw the photograph wept in silence. Others felt betrayed, seeing their divine ruler dwarfed by a foreign general. Yet in that image, a new reality was born. The myth had ended. From the Allied perspective, this transformation was no less profound. Many American soldiers arrived in Japan expecting hostility. They had seen the fanaticism of Japanese troops in the Pacific. Soldiers who fought to the last man, civilians who leapt from cliffs in Okinawa. They imagined an occupation marked by riots and ambushes. Instead, they found a nation so defeated, so exhausted, that resistance had dissolved before it began. Captain Robert Feary, an aide in MacArthur's headquarters, later wrote, "The Japanese were not a conquered enemy. They were a people stunned by their own blindness." Allied officers walked through the ruins of Tokyo and were met not with hatred, but with quiet bowing and polite greetings. Many were unsettled by this humility, unsure whether it came from respect, fear, or sheer despair. American war correspondents documented the paradox. In Hiroshima, a photographer captured a line of civilians waiting for food beside a U.S. Army truck marked with the words, "Food for Peace." The caption read, "They expected revenge. They received bread." The photograph ran in newspapers across the world, symbolizing a moral victory that transcended battlefields. But beneath this surface of calm, the emotional toll on the Japanese people deepened. Soldiers returning from China or Burma came home to find their families gone and their emperor renouncing divinity. Veterans who had survived jungle campaigns or kamikaze training now struggled to reconcile their sacrifice with the truth. They asked questions that no one could answer. Had they fought for a lie? Had their deaths meant nothing? In some towns, shrines quietly removed the symbols of imperial worship. Temples replaced patriotic slogans with prayers for the dead. All the dead, not just Japanese. Buddhist monks held memorials for both Japanese and Allied soldiers. an act that would have been unthinkable only a year earlier. The war had stripped away certainties, leaving only the shared weight of loss. Meanwhile, American soldiers experienced their own transformation. Many wrote home that Japan was unlike any place they had known. Clean, disciplined, courteous even in ruin. "We bombed them into dust," one GI wrote, "and yet they bow when we pass." It was a sentiment echoed by MacArthur himself, who later said, "These people are the world's greatest imitators. Give them a model of democracy, and they will build one stronger than our own." This was the first angle of post-war Japan, the human one, defined not by battles or treaties, but by the fragile meeting of mercy and shame. A defeated people learning that kindness could come from an enemy, victors learning that conquest could mean responsibility. Yet beneath this uneasy peace lay deeper transformations still to come: cultural, ideological, and moral. Because when the films began to play in schools, halls, and barracks, the Japanese people would be forced to confront a truth that words alone could never carry. In the winter of 1945, the new Japan began not with speeches but with film reels. Projectors rattled inside school halls and municipal theaters, their light flickering across faces that had not smiled in years. On the screens appeared images the public had never been allowed to see. Allied soldiers freeing prisoners, Japanese soldiers surrendering, mushroom clouds rising over burned cities. The occupation authorities called these education films, but to the Japanese people, they were revelations. For decades, the imperial government had constructed a world of illusion. The emperor was divine, the war was holy, and Japan was destined to rule Asia. Propaganda had filled newspapers, classrooms, and cinema screens with triumphs that never happened. Even as cities burned, official broadcasts spoke of glorious withdrawal and strategic patience. The truth had been buried beneath reverence. Now, the light of Allied cameras unearthed it. American and British filmmakers, working under the Civil Information and Education Section, CIE, organized thousands of screenings across Japan. These films were carefully chosen, not to humiliate, but to illuminate. Titles such as Our Job in Japan, Democracy in Action, and Know Your Enemy played to audiences of school teachers, veterans, and housewives. They were accompanied by translated leaflets explaining democratic values, the concept of individual rights, and the meaning of peace. At first, many viewers were skeptical. Some refused to attend, others left in silence, muttering that the films were lies. But repetition did its work. The more the people saw, the harder it became to deny. One of the most powerful moments came during the screening of footage from Nanjing and Bataan. Captured, Allied films showing atrocities committed by Japanese forces in Asia. The images were harrowing. Civilians executed, prisoners emaciated, entire towns burned. For the Japanese audience, this was almost unendurable. They had been taught that their nation had liberated Asia from Western oppression. Now, they saw their soldiers acting as the oppressors. In many halls, sobs filled the silence. Some refused to look. Others covered their faces with trembling hands. A few veterans rose and walked out, unable to bear what they saw. But the change had begun. For the first time, the Japanese public was confronting not only defeat, but guilt. Beyond the cinema, the occupation's re-education campaign spread through every corner of life. Schools rewrote textbooks. Words like divine emperor and sacred war were erased. New lessons introduced democracy, equality, and international cooperation. Teachers who had once drilled students to die for the empire now taught them to speak freely and think critically. This transformation was not easy. Many teachers themselves struggled to adjust, torn between loyalty to their old beliefs and the new order imposed by their conquerors. Yet, over time, a new generation began to absorb the lessons. Children learned that the emperor was not a god, that freedom was not treason, and that peace was not weakness. Cultural life, too, began to change. Newspapers printed articles on women's rights and labor unions. Magazines published photographs of American jazz musicians and baseball players. Theaters that once staged patriotic plays now hosted Western dramas and comedies. In 1946, the film Those Who Make Tomorrow depicted Japanese workers organizing for better conditions. A storyline unimaginable just a year before. But perhaps the most symbolic change was found in the radio, the same medium through which the emperor's surrender had been heard. Under Allied supervision, radio stations aired new programs promoting public debate and civic awareness. For the first time, citizens could hear differing opinions, even mild criticism of government policy. In a society that had once punished thought itself, this was a quiet revolution. August 15, 1945. The morning air over Tokyo was still heavy with the scent of ash. Charred rooftops stretched across a silent city, where once the proud heartbeat of an empire had thundered. Families gathered around wooden radios, their faces pale, their clothes worn thin from years of war and hunger. The hour was approaching noon. For the first time in history, the voice of the emperor, the living God, would speak directly to his people. The static crackled. Then a trembling voice filled the air. Soft, formal, almost broken. We have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace. Few could fully understand the archaic court language, but they didn't need to. The tone was enough. Mothers pressed their hands to their mouths. Men stared at the floor. Children clung to their fathers, whispering questions no one could answer. Japan, the invincible empire, had surrendered. The divine light they had been taught to worship had dimmed to a human whisper. And as tears fell on the tatami mats, few knew that the greater shock had yet to arrive. When American soldiers would step onto Japanese soil, not as destroyers, but as bearers of truth that would shatter everything they had ever believed. In the summer of 1945, Japan stood on the edge of annihilation. Its cities were ashes, its army broken, its people starving. Yet, the government clung to a delusion that victory could still be achieved through spirit, sacrifice, and divine favor. Since late 1944, American B-29 bombers had darkened the skies above the Japanese home islands. Operation Meeting House, the firebombing of Tokyo on March 9–10, 1945, had turned the capital into a sea of fire. In a single night, over 100,000 civilians perished. Entire districts were reduced to smoking ruins. The air reeked of burnt paper, bamboo, and flesh. Still, the propaganda machine told citizens that Japan would never yield, that the emperor's spirit guided them toward an inevitable miracle. By 18th July, even the most loyal subjects could sense the truth. The miracle would never come. Allied forces had taken Okinawa after a brutal 82-day battle, bringing the war to Japan's doorstep. Kamikaze pilots, once hailed as divine warriors, were now seen as desperate boys sent to die for a cause that no longer had direction. Inside the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito's advisors debated the impossible. Some urged surrender. Others demanded one final, decisive battle to preserve honor. The people outside these walls, farmers, widows, orphans, had no voice in that decision. They queued for rice that no longer arrived, buried loved ones in makeshift graves, and prayed under the sound of distant bombers. Then, in early August, the world changed forever. At 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945, the city of Hiroshima ceased to exist. The atomic bomb, codenamed Little Boy, exploded with the force of 15,000 tons of TNT. Tens of thousands were incinerated in seconds. Many more suffered burns so severe that even doctors could not describe them without trembling. 3 days later, Nagasaki met the same fate. For Japan's leaders, the message was unmistakable. No divine wind could protect them now. Emperor Hirohito, long shielded from the realities of war, was finally confronted with the devastation. Eyewitnesses later recalled his face, pale, shaken, and silent, as he viewed photographs of Hiroshima. He is said to have whispered only one word: horrifying. Still, factions within the government resisted surrender. The Supreme War Council remained divided. Some generals argued that surrender would disgrace the nation for 1,000 years. Others believed unconditional submission to the Allies would lead to the emperor's death and the end of the imperial line. But the people could no longer bear the cost. Every day, new trains arrived from the countryside carrying the burned, the starving, and the homeless. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, all were rubble. Entire families slept in the ruins of schools and temples, praying for food or mercy. The empire had become a wasteland. On August 9th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. The last illusion of negotiation collapsed. Surrounded, shattered, and without hope, the emperor made the most consequential decision in Japanese history. On August 14, 1945, Hirohito recorded his Gyokuon Hoso, the Jewel Voice broadcast, announcing Japan's surrender. The next day, his trembling voice reached the nation. For most civilians, it was the first time they had ever heard their emperor speak, and it was the moment they realized he was not divine. He was mortal, fallible, human. Across the country, disbelief mixed with grief. Some wept in silence. Others screamed in anguish, tearing off their headbands or smashing portraits of the emperor. Yet, many felt a strange relief. The war was over. The killing, the hunger, the burning skies, all of it, finally, would end. But as the smoke cleared, another question lingered. If the emperor was not divine, then what else had been a lie? The answer would arrive not through myth or rumor, but through the boots of foreign soldiers soon to walk their streets, carrying cameras, food, and films that would show Japan its own reflection. When the first Allied troops set foot on Japanese soil in late August 1945, the world held its breath. For years, Japan's wartime propaganda had painted the Americans as demons, brutal invaders who would slaughter civilians and defile their land. Mothers were told to kill their children before surrendering. Teachers instructed students to leap from cliffs rather than face capture. But when the soldiers arrived, something unexpected happened. The demons did not come. Men in olive uniforms stepped carefully off their transports, helmets tilted against the sun, weapons lowered, their movements cautious. Many carried chocolate, cigarettes, and chewing gum, gifts for the children who peeked nervously from behind broken walls. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, landed at Atsugi Airfield on August 30, 1945. His arrival symbolized a new order, calm, composed, and deliberate. MacArthur walked through the lines of saluting American soldiers, his corncob pipe clamped between his teeth, eyes fixed on Tokyo. He had one mission: to rebuild a nation without destroying its soul. The surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri on September 2nd formalized Japan's defeat. Representatives of the emperor stood before the Allied delegation, trembling as they signed the instrument of surrender. General Yoshijiro Numazu's hand shook as he placed his signature beside the American names. Above them, the sun broke through the clouds, and for the first time in years, Japan's skies were free of warplanes. In the weeks that followed, the transformation began. MacArthur ordered that Japan would not be treated as a conquered land, but as a nation to be reborn. The emperor, once the untouchable god of war, was allowed to remain on his throne, but as a symbol, not a sovereign. For many Japanese, This decision was both a relief and a revelation. The occupation forces set about dismantling the machinery of the old empire. The military was disbanded. Secret police units dissolved. Wartime leaders were arrested and placed on trial. Propaganda materials, posters, textbooks, films, were confiscated or destroyed. In their place, the Americans introduced new materials promoting democracy, freedom, and human rights. It was in this context that the Japanese people began to encounter the truth, not through words, but through images. Allied authorities screened documentary films showing the destruction of the war, the treatment of prisoners, and the atrocities committed by the Imperial Army in China, Korea, and Southeast Asia. For many Japanese, these images were almost impossible to comprehend. They had been taught that Japan's war had been noble, that their soldiers had liberated Asia from Western oppression. Now, they saw starving captives, razed villages, and civilians executed by Japanese troops. In darkened community halls, civilians sat in stunned silence as projectors whirred. Some refused to believe what they saw. Others wept quietly, whispering that such things could not be true. Yet, as the films continued, denial gave way to silence. A silence deeper than grief. It was the silence of awakening. At the same time, the occupation administration distributed food and medicine to the starving population. American field hospitals treated malnourished civilians. Military kitchens served rice and bread in the ruins of Tokyo and Yokohama. Japanese children, once taught to hate foreigners, now lined up for powdered milk from smiling American soldiers. It was a transformation both surreal and deeply human. The emperor himself began to change before his people's eyes. In public appearances, Hirohito no longer wore military uniform. He visited the bombed cities in a simple suit, bowing to the survivors. For the first time, civilians looked upon him not as a deity, but as a man walking among them. His presence, once ethereal, now carried the quiet weight of shared suffering. In January 1946, the emperor issued his Ningen Sengen, the Humanity Declaration. In it, he renounced the divine status that had defined his reign. The statement, drafted under Allied supervision, was broadcast across Japan. The ties between us and our people have always stood upon mutual trust and affection, it read. They do not depend upon mere legends and myths. It was a sentence that broke centuries of belief. For millions, it was the moment their entire understanding of loyalty, honor, and identity dissolved.